Picture this. You're standing in your wedding suit at 6 a.m., holding a note that says your bride has run away with your best man. The venue is paid for, the guests are coming, and everyone you've ever known is about to witness your humiliation. Most people would cancel everything, hide under a rock, and spend months in therapy. But sometimes life gives you an opportunity to rewrite your story in the most spectacular way possible. What I did next shocked everyone, including myself, and turned the worst day of my life into the beginning of something extraordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. on September 28th, and for exactly 30 seconds, I was the happiest man alive. Today was my wedding day. It's Madison Kelly, the woman I'd been planning to marry for 8 months, was finally going to become Madison Thompson. I'd saved every penny for 2 years to give her the perfect wedding at Riverside Gardens Estate. It's the kind of place she'd always dreamed about with its historic mansion and gardens. Overlooking the Delaware River, I remember lying in bed in my downtown Millbrook apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how everything had fallen into place. The weather forecast showed perfect autumn temperatures. The leaves were turning those brilliant shades of gold and burgundy that matched. Our wedding colors and even my normally chaotic family had managed to coordinate their travel plans without any major drama. My younger brother Tom had driven up from Maryland the night before. My sister Lisa, who'd been helping coordinate everything, texted me at midnight with a simple message. "Everything's perfect, Jake. Get some sleep, Madison." Had been staying at the bridal suite at Riverside Gardens since Thursday, claiming she needed the time to prepare and didn't want me to see her before the ceremony. It was tradition, she said, and Madison loved traditions almost as much as she loved posting about them on her Instagram account. At 50,000 followers, at Madison Lifestyle had become her full-time job, and our wedding was going to be the content event of the year for her. She'd been documenting every detail of our engagement and wedding planning for months, turning our relationship into a carefully curated love story that her followers couldn't get enough of. I should have seen the signs, but when you're in love, you interpret everything through rose-colored glasses. It's the way she'd been distant during our final wedding planning meetings, claiming she was just stressed about getting all the details right. How she'd suddenly decided Ryan Mitchell, my college roommate and best man, should handle more of the coordination since he was so much better with logistics. The fact that she'd stopped asking me about honeymoon plans and seemed more interested in how the wedding photos would look on her social media than how our actual marriage would unfold. Ryan had been my roommate at Penn State, and we'd stayed close even after he moved to Philadelphia to work at Mitchell & Associates investment firm. He made the kind of money that allowed him to wear suits that cost more than my monthly rent and drive cars that turned heads wherever he went. But he'd always been competitive, even back in college, and I'd learned to navigate his need to be the best at everything. When Madison suggested he be my best man, it seemed natural. He was charismatic, organized, and had the kind of presence that made him perfect for public speaking. What I didn't realize was that his charm worked just as well on my fiancée as it did on his investment clients. The first hint that something was wrong came when my phone buzzed at 5:45 a.m. with a text from Carmen Santos. "Our wedding planner. Jake, need to speak with you immediately. Please call when you get this." Carmen wasn't the type to panic about anything. She'd been planning weddings for 15 years and had a reputation for handling crises with the calm efficiency of a military commander. If Carmen was texting me at dawn on my wedding day, something was seriously wrong. I called her back immediately, my heart already starting to race. "Carmen, what's going on?" There was a long pause before she spoke, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "Jake, I'm at the estate right now doing final setup, and I need you to come here as soon as possible. Don't call Madison, don't call Ryan, just come." The drive to Riverside Gardens usually took 20 minutes from my apartment, but I made it in 12, my mind racing through every possible disaster scenario. Maybe there was a problem with the catering, the flowers hadn't been delivered, or someone had double-booked the venue. These were fixable problems, the kind of wedding day glitches that became funny stories you told at anniversary dinners. When I pulled into the gravel parking lot behind the estate, I saw Carmen standing by the main entrance with an expression I'd never seen before. She was holding an envelope in her hands, and her usually perfect composure was nowhere to be found. "Jake," she said. As I approached, "I found this on the registration table this morning when I arrived to set up. It has your name on it." Envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive stuff that matched our wedding invitations. My name was written across the front in Madison's distinctive handwriting, the same script she'd used to address all our wedding invitations by hand because she said it looked more personal for her social media photos. I opened it with hands that had started to shake, though I still didn't understand why. The note inside was brief, written in the same careful handwriting. "Jake, by the time you read this, Ryan and I will be on our way to Vegas. I know this isn't the way anyone imagined this would happen, but sometimes love finds you when you least expect it. Ryan and I have been fighting our feelings for months, and we finally realized we can't deny what's between us anymore. The venue is paid for, and I know you'll figure out what to do. I hope someday you'll understand that this is better for everyone. I'm sorry it had to happen this way, Madison." I read the note 3 times before the words actually registered in my brain. Even then, it felt like I was reading about someone else's life. Like this was a script for a movie I'd somehow been cast in without auditioning. Madison had eloped. With Ryan, my fiancé and my best man, had run away together on the morning of our wedding, leaving me standing in a parking lot holding a note that explained away 2 years of my life in 5 sentences. Carmen was watching my face, and I could see the exact moment she realized I'd processed what the note said. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she might cry. "When did you find this?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded about an hour ago. "I came early to set up the final details, and it was just sitting there on the registration table. I checked the bridal suite, and all of Madison's things are gone. The bed doesn't look like it was slept in." I looked up at the mansion where I was supposed to be getting married in 10 hours. The morning sun was hitting the windows just right, making the whole building glow like something out of a fairy tale. The gardens were in perfect autumn bloom, exactly the way Madison had dreamed they would be. The wedding arch where we were supposed to exchange vows was already in place, decorated with burgundy and gold flowers that had cost more than my car payment. "Right. The guests," I said suddenly. "We have to call the guests." Carmen nodded. "We can handle that. I have the contact list, and my team can start making calls. Jake, I'm so sorry. In 15 years of planning weddings, I've never had anything like this happen." That's when it hit me. 120 people were going to drive to Millbrook Valley today, expecting to see me marry Madison Kelly. My parents had flown in from Arizona. Madison's family had driven up from Virginia. My college friends had taken time off work and booked hotel rooms. Everyone I cared about was going to witness the most humiliating moment of my life. But as I stood there in the parking lot, holding Madison's note and looking at the venue where I'd imagined starting my married life, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling devastated, I started feeling angry, not just hurt or disappointed, but genuinely furious. Madison hadn't just left me. She'd made me complicit in my own humiliation by letting me continue planning and paying for a wedding she knew wasn't going to happen. She'd let me spend the last few weeks excitedly talking to vendors and family members about details for a ceremony she was already planning to skip. She'd watched me stress about writing my vows and choosing the right cologne and making sure my suit fit perfectly, all while knowing she was going to run away with my best man. And Ryan had stood up at my bachelor party 2 weeks ago and given a speech about friendship and loyalty and how lucky Madison was to be marrying someone like me. He'd helped me plan the honeymoon, offering advice about restaurants in Italy, and even lending me his expensive camera so Madison and I could take better photos. He'd been texting me encouragement all week, reminding me to eat breakfast this morning and telling me how proud he was to be my best man. They'd both been lying to my face while planning their escape, and they'd done it with the kind of casual cruelty that takes real effort. "Carmen," I said, and I could hear the change in my own voice. "Before we start calling guests, I need to ask you something. Is there any chance the wedding could still happen today?" She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Jake, honey, I know this is a shock, but Madison is gone. The bride eloped with someone else. I know that," I said. "What? The venue is paid for, right?" The flowers are ordered, the catering is set, the photographer is coming, the pastor is scheduled. Everything is ready, except for the fact that I don't have a bride. Carmen nodded slowly, clearly not understanding where I was going with this. What if I found a different bride? The question hung in the air between us. I could see Carmen trying to process whether I was having some kind of psychological break. To be fair, I wasn't entirely sure myself. But standing there in the parking lot, surrounded by the evidence of Madison and Ryan's betrayal, I realized something important. They'd planned this whole thing assuming I would just collapse and disappear, that I'd quietly cancel everything and spend the next 6 months hiding from anyone who might ask about what happened. They'd never considered the possibility that I might have other plans. "Jake," Carmen said carefully, "I think maybe you should call your family and go home. Take some time to process this before you make any major decisions." But I was all ready. Thinking about Sophie Chen, Madison's maid of honor, who was supposed to be getting ready at her apartment downtown this morning. Sophie, who'd spent the last 8 months helping Madison plan a wedding while secretly designing all our invitations and programs on her own time, because she wanted everything to be perfect. Sophie, who'd listened to Madison complain about every detail of the wedding planning, while never once suggesting that maybe Madison didn't actually want to get married. Sophie, who'd been Madison's college roommate, but had somehow become one. Of my closest friends during the engagement, the person I found myself talking to when Madison was too busy with her social media content to focus on actual wedding decisions. Sophie, who had no idea that her best friend had just destroyed both of our lives in a single morning. Carmen, I said, "I need to make a phone call. Don't cancel anything yet. Give me 2 hours." She stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Okay. Whatever you're thinking about doing, please be careful. You're in shock right now, and you might regret making impulsive decisions." But as I walked back to my car, I realized I wasn't in shock at all. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I was thinking completely clearly. Madison and Ryan had made their choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. The drive back to downtown Millbrook gave me just enough time to figure out exactly what I was going to say to Sophie Chen. And by the time I pulled up in front of her apartment building, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to get married today, just not to the person anyone was expecting. The question was whether Sophie would be crazy enough to say yes to the most insane proposal in the history of wedding planning, and whether we could pull off the most spectacular reversal of fortune that Riverside Gardens estate had ever witnessed. One way or another, Madison Kelly and Ryan Mitchell were about to learn that underestimating Jake Thompson had been the biggest mistake of their lives. Sophie Chen lived in a converted warehouse apartment above her family's restaurant, Golden Lotus, on Main Street. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The building was one of those charming downtown renovations that Millbrook Valley had become famous for, where old industrial spaces had been transformed into trendy lofts that attracted young professionals who wanted small-town charm with big city amenities. I'd been to her place exactly 3 times during the engagement, always with Madison, always for wedding-related planning sessions where Sophie would spread her design materials across her kitchen table and show us mock-ups for invitations or programs. What I remembered most about Sophie's apartment wasn't the exposed brick walls or the industrial lighting that Madison always photographed for her social media. It was how quiet and peaceful everything felt, like stepping into a different world, where people actually listened to each other and conversations didn't revolve around follower counts and engagement metrics. Sophie had this way of making everyone feel heard, even when Madison was dominating the conversation with her latest content ideas. As I climbed the stairs to her apartment, I realized I'd never actually been alone with Sophie before. Madison had always been there, directing the conversation and making decisions, while Sophie quietly took notes and offered gentle suggestions that somehow always made everything better. In 8 months of wedding planning, I'd probably spoken directly to Sophie for a total of maybe 2 hours, but somehow I felt like I knew her better than people I'd been friends with for years. I knocked on her door at 7:15 a.m., knowing she'd be awake because she'd always open the restaurant early on Saturdays to help her mother with prep work. The door opened almost immediately, and Sophie appeared wearing paint-splattered jeans and an oversized sweater, her long black hair pulled back in a messy bun. She had a coffee mug in one hand, and what looked like wedding program layouts spread across her dining room table visible behind her. "Jake?" She looked genuinely surprised to see me. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be getting ready? And why do you look like someone just told you the world was ending?" That's when I realized I had no idea how to start this conversation. How do you tell someone that their best friend has just destroyed your life and then ask them to help you rebuild it in the most dramatic way possible? How do you explain that you're standing on their doorstep at 7 in the morning with a plan? So crazy, it might actually be brilliant. "Sophie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you say anything, okay?" She stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for me to come inside. Her apartment smelled like coffee and the faint aroma of jasmine tea, mixed with the scent of art supplies and fresh paper. The walls were covered with her design work. Everything from wedding invitations to corporate logos to what looked like illustrations for children's books. It was the kind of space that felt creative and lived in, completely different from Madison's sterile, cam-ready apartment where everything was positioned for optimal lighting. "Sit down," Sophie said, pointing to her couch. "What? You're making me nervous." I handed her Madison's note without saying anything. Sometimes the best way to deliver devastating news is to let the words speak for themselves. I watched Sophie's face as she read, seeing the exact moment when confusion turned to understanding and then to something that looked like a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "She left with Ryan." Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "This morning, on your wedding day, Carmen found the note about an hour ago. Maybe in Vegas by now, maybe already married. All the guests are going to start driving here in a few hours expecting to see a wedding. Instead, they're going to get the most humiliating disaster story of the year." Sophie sank into the chair across from me, still holding the note. "Jake, I'm so sorry, I had no idea." Madison never said anything, never even hinted that she was having doubts. "And Ryan, I barely know him, but he seems so supportive of you too. They've probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months. All those times Madison said she was too busy to discuss wedding details, she was probably with him. All those times Ryan offered to help with coordination, he was probably gathering information to make their escape plan work better." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing not just the betrayal of what Madison had done to me, but what it meant for her own friendship. Madison hadn't just abandoned me, she'd lied to Sophie for months, letting her invest time and energy and genuine care into planning a wedding that was never going to happen. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. This was the moment of truth. Either Sophie was going to think I'd lost my mind, or she was going to be intrigued enough to hear me out. Either way, I was about to find out if my instinct about her was right. "I'm going to get married today," I said. "Riverside Gardens. At 4 o'clock, just like we planned." Sophie stared at me. "Jake, Madison is gone. You can't get married without a bride." "You're right. That's why I'm here." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. I watched Sophie's expression cycle through confusion, realization, shock, and something that might have been panic. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to help me turn the worst day of my life into something Madison and Ryan will never forget. I'm asking you to help me show everyone who knows us that we're not the kind of people who just disappear when things get difficult. And yes, I'm asking you to marry me, but not for the reasons you might think." Sophie set the note down on her coffee table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Jake, you're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. This is crazy." "Maybe it is crazy, but let me ask you something. How much money do you think Madison and I spent on this wedding?" "I don't know." 35,000? $37,463. That's 2 years of saving every penny I could, plus contributions from both our families. The venue is paid for. The flowers are ordered. The catering is set for 120 people. The photographer is coming. Pastor Williams is scheduled to perform the ceremony. Everything is ready. Sophie was listening, but I could. "See, she still thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Madison and Ryan think they've won," I continued. "They think they've left me with nothing but humiliation and a massive financial loss. They think I'm going to spend today hiding in my apartment while everyone I know finds out that my fiancé preferred my best man. They're probably laughing about it right now, thinking about how clever they were. And your solution is to marry someone else? Jake, marriage isn't a business transaction. You can't just substitute one person for another like you're changing items on a restaurant order. She was right, of course, but she was also missing the point. Sophie, I'm not asking you to marry me because I think you're interchangeable with Madison. I'm asking you to marry me because you're the opposite of Madison in every way that matters. That got her attention. She leaned forward slightly, and I could see that I had at least earned the right to explain myself. Madison turned our relationship into a performance for her social media followers. Everything we did together had to be photographed and posted and optimized for engagement. She cared more about how our wedding would look online than how our marriage would actually work. She never asked me what I wanted, never considered that I might have opinions about the most important day of our lives. Sophie nodded slowly. I could see her remembering all the planning sessions where Madison had dominated every conversation. But you, I continued, you spent 8 months asking me questions Madison never thought to ask. You wanted to know what colors I actually liked, what kind of music made me happy, what traditions mattered to my family. You designed invitations that reflected both of us, not just Madison's aesthetic. You cared about making our wedding meaningful, not just photogenic. Jake, that was my job. I was the maid of honor. No, it wasn't your job. It was who you are. And here's what I realized. Standing in that parking lot this morning, Madison leaving might be the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it means I don't have to spend the rest of my life with someone who sees me as a prop in her social media content. Sophie was quiet again, but I could see her thinking. She wasn't dismissing the idea anymore. She was actually considering it. Even if I said yes, which I'm not saying I am, this isn't legal. You can't just swap brides on the day of the wedding. There are licenses and paperwork and waiting periods. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and showed her the screen. I called the courthouse on the way here. Pennsylvania has a 3-day waiting period for marriage licenses, but there's an exception for cases where one of the parties is entering military service. There are other extenuating circumstances. If we can get to the courthouse when it opens at 9 and explain the situation, they can issue us a same-day license. Sophie stared at my phone. You've already researched this. I've researched everything. The legal requirements, the logistics, even how to handle the guest list. Sophie, this isn't a crazy impulse. This is a carefully considered plan, too. Turn Madison and Ryan's betrayal into the beginning of something better. She stood up and walked to her window, looking down at Main Street where a few early morning joggers were already out enjoying the perfect autumn weather. I could see her reflection in the glass, and she looked like she was having the kind of internal debate that changes the entire course of your life. Jake, what if this doesn't work? What if we go through with this, and it's a disaster? What if people think we're both having nervous breakdowns, and we'll have failed spectacularly while trying to do something brave instead of succeeding quietly at being victims? Sophie, Madison, and Ryan are counting on us to collapse. They want us to cancel everything and disappear so they can come back from Vegas with their romantic elopement story and never have to face the consequences of what they did. She turned back to face me. And if we get married today, then they come back to find out that their betrayal backfired completely. Instead of destroying me, they freed me to marry someone who actually cares about making me happy. Instead of getting away with their deception, they made themselves the villains in a story where we ended up as the heroes. Sophie walked back to her chair and sat down, but this time she was looking at me with a different expression. It's not shock or concern, but genuine curiosity. What exactly are you proposing? And I mean practically, not romantically. I'm proposing that we get married today for real, with all the legal paperwork and witnesses and everything. But I'm also proposing that we think of it as a 1-year experiment. We take the honeymoon. We move in together. We give ourselves 12 months to see if what I think could happen between us actually does happen. And if it doesn't, then we get divorced amicably and remain friends. No drama, no hard feelings, no financial complications. I'll make sure you're protected legally and financially no matter what happens. Sophie was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to think she was going to say no. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, more confident. "Jake, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. When you were planning this wedding with Madison, were you happy? Not excited about getting married in general, but specifically happy about marrying her?" Duh. The question hit me harder than I expected. I thought about all the planning sessions where Madison had shot down my suggestions, all the conversations where she'd been more interested in her phone than in talking to me, all the moments when I'd felt like a supporting character. In my own engagement? No, I said finally. I don't think I was. I think I was happy about the idea of getting married, about starting a life with someone, about having a family and building something together. But Madison never wanted to build anything with me. She wanted me to fit into the life she was already creating for herself. Sophie nodded like she'd been expecting that answer. "Can I tell you something? Every time I was here working on wedding plans with you two, I kept thinking about how much better you deserved. Madison never listened to you, never asked what you wanted, never seemed to consider that your opinions might matter. It drove me crazy. Then why didn't you say anything? Because she was my friend and I thought maybe I was seeing things wrong. I thought maybe that was just how their relationship worked, and it wasn't my place to interfere." Sophie stood up again, but this time she walked over to her dining room table, where the wedding programs were spread out. She picked up one of the layouts and studied it for a moment. "I designed these programs with your favorite quote, not Madison's. Did you know that? She wanted some generic romantic saying she found on Pinterest, but I used the one you mentioned from your grandfather's wedding speech. Love isn't about finding someone you can live with. It's about finding someone you can't imagine living without." I had no idea she'd done that. Madison had shown me the final program design, but I'd never realized Sophie had incorporated something that mattered to me. "Sophie, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked up from the program layout. "Okay, is there any part of you that thinks this could actually work? It's not the crazy logistics of pulling off a same-day wedding, but the idea of you and me together, because I have to tell you, sitting here talking to you this morning, I'm realizing that some of my happiest moments during this whole engagement process were the times when it was just the three of us planning, and you were asking me questions, and actually listening to my answers." Sophie set the program down and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts terrified and hopeful. "Jake, I've had feelings for you since the first time Madison brought you to meet me. But you were with her, and she was my friend, and I never would have acted on it. I've spent 8 months watching you try to make Madison happy, while she treated you like you were lucky to be tolerated. It broke my heart. The admission hung in the air between us, changing everything. This wasn't just about revenge against Madison and Ryan anymore. This was about two people who had been circling around each other for months, never quite finding the right moment to be honest about what they felt. "So what do you say?" I asked. "Do you want to shock everyone, No? And get married in about 9 hours?" Sophie was quiet for one more long moment, and then she smiled, the kind of smile that makes you understand why people write songs about falling in love. "Jake Thompson, I thought you'd never ask. The Millbrook Valley Courthouse opened at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, and Sophie and I were the first people through the doors. The building was one of those classic Pennsylvania stone structures that had been serving the community since the 1890s, with high ceilings and old wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them. Under normal circumstances, it would have been closed on a weekend. But Millbrook Valley was small enough that the county clerk, Mrs. Patricia Hoffman, lived right down the street and had agreed to open up for what she assumed was a standard marriage license emergency. Mrs. Hoffman had been issuing marriage licenses in Millbrook Valley for 23 years. And in all that time, she'd never encountered a situation quite like ours. When we walked into her office and I explained that we needed a same-day marriage license because my original fiancée had eloped with my best man and we wanted to get married at the same venue this afternoon, she stared at us for a full 30 seconds before asking us to repeat the entire story. Sophie had changed into a simple blue dress and had somehow managed to look composed and confident, despite the fact that we were asking a government official to help us pull off what was essentially the most elaborate relationship pivot in the history of Pennsylvania marriage law. She held my hand while I explained the situation to Mrs. Hoffman, and I could feel her steady presence anchoring me whenever the absurdity of what we were doing threatened to overwhelm my resolve. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Mrs. Hoffman said, adjusting her glasses and looking at both of us with the expression of someone who had thought she'd seen everything. You were supposed to marry someone else today, but she ran away with your best man, so now you want to marry her maid of honor instead. And you need me to waive the 3-day waiting period, so you can use the same wedding venue and have the ceremony this afternoon. That's exactly right, I said. And you two are certain about this decision. Because marriage is a serious legal commitment, and I have to ask if you've given adequate consideration to what you're doing. Sophie spoke up for the first time. Since we'd entered the office, Mrs. Hoffman, I know this sounds impulsive, but Jake and I have known each other for 8 months. We've spent countless hours together planning what was supposed to be his wedding to my best friend. We've talked about everything from family values to career goals to what we want our futures to look like. The only thing that's impulsive about this is the timing. Mrs. Hoffman looked at Sophie with something that might have been approval. And you're comfortable marrying someone who was engaged to your friend as recently as this morning? Friend lied to both of us for months while planning to betray us both. She's not my friend anymore, and Jake deserves better than someone who would treat him that way. There was something in Sophie's voice when she said it that convinced Mrs. Hoffman we weren't having a joint nervous breakdown. After asking us a few more questions about our identification and resident status, she pulled out the paperwork for an expedited marriage license and began walking us through the process. The legal requirements turned out to be surprisingly straightforward ones. Now, Mrs. Hoffman decided we met the criteria for exceptional circumstances. We had to provide identification, verify that we were both legally free to marry, and pay the standard licensing fee. The most complicated part was the waiting period waiver, which required Mrs. Hoffman to document our justification and file additional paperwork with the state. I have to ask one more time, she said as she prepared the final documents. Are you both absolutely certain about this? Because once I process this license, you'll be legally authorized to marry each other. And there's no changing your minds without going through a formal divorce process. Sophie and I looked at each other, and I saw something in her expression that made my heart skip. It wasn't just determination or defiance against Madison and Ryan. It was genuine excitement about the possibility of building something together. We're certain, I said. Absolutely certain, Sophie added. Mrs. Hoffman stamped the license with the kind of decisive motion that suggested she'd decided we were either brave or crazy. But either way, we deserved the chance to find out which one was true. By 10:30, we were legally authorized to get married, and we had exactly 5.5 hours to coordinate the most complicated wedding day. Logistics rescue in the history of Riverside Gardens Estate. Our first stop was Golden Lotus, where Sophie's mother, Mrs. Chen, was preparing for the Saturday lunch rush. Mrs. Chen was one of those people who managed to be simultaneously warm and intimidating. The kind of woman who could make you feel completely welcome while also making it clear that she didn't tolerate nonsense. She'd been running Golden Lotus for 15 years and had a reputation for both exceptional food and no-nonsense management style. When we walked into the restaurant kitchen and Sophie announced that she was getting married in 5 hours, Mrs. Chen stopped chopping vegetables and looked at both of us with an expression that suggested she was calculating whether we were serious or whether she needed to call someone for intervention. Sophie Chen, what are you talking about? You're supposed to be the maid of honor at Jake's wedding today, not getting married yourself. Sophie explained the situation while her mother continued to stare at us, occasionally shaking her head, or making small sounds that could have been either disapproval or amazement. When Sophie finished, Mrs. Chen set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. So Madison Kelly ran away with the best man, and now you want to marry Jake instead? Yes, ma'am, I said. And you think this is a good idea? I think Madison leaving was the best thing that could have happened to me. And I think Sophie is the person I should have been planning to marry all along. Mrs. Chen studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct feeling I was being evaluated according to criteria I didn't fully understand. Finally, she nodded once, decisively. Madison Kelly never appreciated what she had, And she never treated you with proper respect? Sophie has been saying for months that you deserved better. I approve of this marriage. The relief I felt at Mrs. Chen's approval surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I'd wanted her blessing until she gave it. But she continued, if you hurt my daughter, I will make your life very difficult. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. I understand completely. Good now. What do you need me to do to help with this wedding? Mrs. Chen's practical support turned out to be exactly what we needed. She immediately called 3 of her regular customers, who also happened to be friends of Sophie's family. And within 20 minutes, we had a small army of people who were willing to help coordinate the last-minute details of our wedding day. Pivot. The most urgent issue was informing the guests. Couldn't let 120 people drive to Riverside Gardens expecting to see me marry Madison, only to discover the completely different situation they were walking into. But we also couldn't call everyone individually without spending the entire day on the phone and missing our own wedding. Sophie suggested we handle it the modern way. She drafted a message explaining the situation and sent it to the 10 people, most likely to spread the news quickly and accurately. Her message was a masterpiece of efficient communication. Jake and Madison's wedding has been canceled due to Madison's decision to elope with someone else this morning. However, Jake and Sophie will be getting married at the same venue, same time, same celebration. Everyone is still invited, and we hope you'll join us for what promises to be an unforgettable day. Please spread the word to anyone else you know who is planning to attend. Within an hour, the news was circulating through both our social networks faster than any official announcement could have reached people. My phone started buzzing with text messages from friends and family members who ranged from shocked to confused to absolutely delighted by the turn of events. My brother Tom called from his hotel room at 11:15, and I could hear the amazement in his voice when he spoke. Dake, please tell me I understood Sophie's message correctly. Madison ran off with Ryan, and now you're marrying Sophie this afternoon? That's exactly what's happening. And you're okay? I mean, you're not having some kind of breakdown where you think the solution to being abandoned is to immediately marry someone else. Tom, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Madison leaving was the wake-up call I needed to realize I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Sophie is everything Madison isn't, and I should have seen it months ago. There was a pause, and then Tom started laughing. You know what? Good for you. Madison always seemed more interested in her phone than in you anyway. And Sophie is awesome. Mom and Dad are going to lose their minds when they find out, but they're going to love this story. Similar conversations were happening all over Millbrook Valley as word spread about the dramatic change in wedding plans. Some people were confused, some were concerned, but most were intrigued enough to want to witness whatever was going to happen at Riverside Gardens that afternoon. The vendor coordination turned out to be simpler than expected. Carmen Santos had been preparing for crisis management all morning, and when Sophie and I arrived at the venue at noon to explain our plan, she greeted us with the kind of professional calm that made it clear she was ready for whatever came next. So you want to proceed with the wedding as scheduled, just with a different bride, and a different groom's party, and probably different vows, and definitely a different energy, Sophie said. Can we make it work? Carmen walked us through the venue setup, pointing out what could be changed easily and what would have to stay the same. The flowers were already in place and would work perfectly for any wedding. The catering was set for the number of guests we expected, and the menu wouldn't need to change. The photography timeline would need to be adjusted since we hadn't done any pre-wedding photos. But Danny Rodriguez had been photographing weddings long enough to adapt to unusual circumstances. The biggest logistical challenge was the wedding party. Madison's bridesmaids had scattered when they received the news, and Ryan's groomsmen were in various states of confusion about what their role should be in a wedding where the groom was marrying someone else. Sophie and I decided to simplify everything by having just Tom as my best man and Sophie's cousin Lucy as her maid of honor. Pastor Williams arrived at 2 o'clock for what he assumed would be a standard final consultation before the ceremony. And when we explained the situation, he sat down heavily in one of the chairs in the estate's library and stared at us for a long moment. In 30 years of performing wedding ceremonies, I have never encountered anything like this situation. Are you willing to perform this ceremony? Sophie asked. Pastor Williams was quiet for a moment, and I could see him working through both the practical and spiritual implications of what we were asking him to do. Jake, this morning you were planning to marry Madison Kelly. Now you want to marry Sophie Chen. Can you help me understand how you're certain this is the right decision? I thought about how to answer that question honestly. Pastor Williams. When I was planning my wedding with Madison, I was excited about getting married. But I wasn't excited about being married to her specifically. I was looking forward to the ceremony and the celebration, but I wasn't looking forward to the life we were going to build together. With Sophie, it's the opposite. I'm excited about every conversation we're going to have, every problem we're going to solve together, every ordinary day we're going to share. Pastor Williams nodded slowly. And Sophie, you were prepared to watch Jake marry your friend this afternoon? Now you're asking me to marry you to him instead.
How do you know?
This isn't just a reaction to being betrayed by Madison, Sophie answered without hesitation. Because I've been in love with Jake since the first time I met him. I've spent 8 months watching him try to make someone happy who didn't deserve his effort. Madison leaving didn't create my feelings for Jake. It just gave me the courage to admit them. Pastor Williams looked at both of us for another long moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd decided we were exactly where we were supposed to be. I'll perform the ceremony, but I want to modify the vows to reflect the unique circumstances of how you've come to be here today. Are you comfortable with that? We spent the next hour working with Pastor Williams to create vows that acknowledged both the unusual way we'd arrived at this moment and the genuine commitment we were making to each other. By 3 o'clock, everything was in place for what would either be the most romantic wedding Riverside Gardens had ever hosted or the most spectacular disaster in the venue's history. As guests began arriving, I realized that Sophie and I had managed to pull off something that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. We'd turned Madison and Ryan's betrayal into the catalyst for a wedding. It felt more authentic and meaningful than anything I could have imagined when I woke up that morning. The best part was knowing that somewhere in Vegas, Madison was probably checking her social media to see the news of her dramatic elopement was generating the kind of attention she'd hoped for. Instead, she was going to find out that her betrayal had backfired so completely that people were already calling it the most romantic love story they'd ever witnessed. At 3:30, with 30 minutes until the ceremony, Sophie and I had a moment alone in the estate's garden. She was wearing Madison's wedding dress. She turned out to fit her perfectly and looked somehow completely different on her than it had in all of Madison's fitting photos. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "I've been ready for this since the moment you said yes this morning." The question is, are you ready to be married to someone who's about to become famous for having the most dramatic wedding day in Pennsylvania history? Sophie laughed, and the sound was everything I'd been missing in my relationship with Madison without even realizing it. "Jake Thompson, I've been ready to marry you since long before you knew you wanted to marry me. In 15 minutes, we would walk down the aisle together and begin a marriage that had started as revenge against two people who thought they could destroy us without consequences. But standing in that garden, holding Sophie's hands and looking into her eyes, I realized that what we were about to do had stopped being about Madison and Ryan hours ago. This was about Sophie and me, and the life we were going to build together, and the love story that had been waiting 8 months for the right moment to begin at exactly 4 o'clock on September 28th. With the autumn sun casting perfect golden light through the trees at Riverside Gardens Estate, I found myself standing at the altar waiting for a bride I'd never imagined I'd be marrying 12 hours earlier. The wedding arch that Madison had spent weeks perfecting with burgundy and gold flowers now framed a completely different love story. One that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced in 2 years of engagement planning. The guests had arrived in waves throughout the afternoon, and the energy in the air was unlike anything I'd ever felt at a wedding before. Instead of the polite, predictable atmosphere of a traditional ceremony, there was an electric sense of anticipation. Everyone knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, a real-time love story that was unfolding in front of their eyes, rather than a carefully choreographed event that had been planned for months. My parents had driven straight from their hotel to the venue after receiving Tom's phone call. When they arrived, my mother took one look at me and immediately understood that this wasn't a rebound or a breakdown. She'd met Sophie several times during the wedding planning process, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes as she realized that her son was about to marry the woman he should have chosen from the beginning. "Jake," she said when she hugged me in the groom's preparation room, "I have to tell you something. Your father and I never thought Madison was right for you, but we didn't want to interfere. Sophie, on the other hand, we've been hoping you'd notice for months." That admission hit me harder than I expected. My parents had seen what I'd been too blind to recognize. Madison and I were fundamentally incompatible, while Sophie and I complemented each other perfectly. They'd watched me struggle to make a relationship work with someone who didn't appreciate me, while the right person was standing right there, helping me plan a wedding that was never going to make me happy. Tom had stepped seamlessly into his role as best man, and when he handed me the rings at 3:45, he grinned with the kind of mischievous delight that reminded me why he'd always been my favorite person to adventure with. "You know, this is going to be the family story we tell at every holiday for the rest of our lives, right?" he said. The day Jake Thompson turned a disaster into the most romantic gesture in family history. The rings were another detail that had fallen into place with almost eerie perfection. Madison had chosen elaborate, expensive bands that reflected her taste for dramatic jewelry. But when Sophie and I had gone to the jeweler that morning to explain our situation, Mr. Peterson had offered to let us exchange them for simpler rings that felt more appropriate for the commitment we were actually making to each other. The new rings were classic gold bands, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of jewelry that would age well and never feel dated. When I'd slipped Sophie's ring onto her finger during our quick rehearsal with Pastor Williams, it had felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized was incomplete. Danny Rodriguez, our photographer, had adapted to the situation with the kind of professional flexibility that comes from years of experience with unpredictable wedding day drama. Instead of the formal posed portraits that Madison had insisted on, he'd been capturing candid moments all afternoon, documenting the genuine emotions and spontaneous interactions that made this day feel authentic rather than performed. "Jake," he'd said while setting up his equipment. He'd been photographing weddings for 12 years, and I can always tell the difference between couples who are putting on a show and couples who are genuinely excited to be marrying each other. What's happening here today is the real thing. As the ceremony time approached, I could see guests finding their seats with an energy level that was completely different from typical wedding attendance. Instead of the polite obligation that often characterizes family gatherings, people seemed genuinely eager to witness whatever was about to unfold. Conversations were animated, laughter was frequent, and there was a sense of collective investment in seeing Sophie and me succeed. Mrs. Chen had claimed a front row seat and was beaming with the kind of maternal pride that made it clear she considered this wedding a personal victory. She'd brought several extended family members who'd driven up from Philadelphia when they heard about the dramatic change in plans. And the Chinese side of the guest section was buzzing with approval for what they clearly viewed as a much more suitable match than Jake and Madison had ever been. Sophie's transformation from maid of honor to bride had been remarkable to witness. The dress that had looked elegant but somehow impersonal on Madison became something entirely different on Sophie. It complemented her natural grace and highlighted her genuine beauty in a way that made everyone understand why this marriage made perfect sense. But more than the physical transformation, there was something in Sophie's demeanor that communicated absolute certainty about what she was doing. She wasn't nervous or uncertain or overwhelmed by the magnitude of changing her entire life in a single day. She was radiant with the confidence of someone who knew she was exactly where she belonged. At 5 minutes before 4, Pastor Williams signaled that it was time to begin. The string quartet that Madison had hired began playing the processional music, but instead of the traditional bridal march, Sophie had chosen a piece that felt more appropriate for the unconventional love story we were celebrating. Tom took his position beside me at the altar, and I felt a moment of surreal gratitude for how perfectly everything had fallen into place. 12 hours ago, I'd been preparing to marry someone who didn't truly love me, surrounded by a wedding party that was going through the motions of celebrating a relationship that was fundamentally flawed. Now I was standing with my brother, waiting to marry a woman who'd been quietly loving me for months while I was too distracted to notice. Music swelled, and Lucy Chen began walking down the aisle as Sophie's maid of honor. She was Sophie's cousin and closest friend, someone who'd known immediately that this marriage was exactly what Sophie had been hoping for, without ever admitting it to herself. Lucy's smile as she walked toward the altar communicated pure joy for her cousin's happiness. Then the music shifted to the bridal processional, and Sophie appeared at the entrance to the garden ceremony space. The collective intake of breath from the assembled guests was audible, but it wasn't just because she looked beautiful in the wedding dress. It was because everyone could see that she was absolutely, completely, perfectly happy. Sophie had chosen to walk down the aisle alone without a father or family member to give her away. She'd explained to Pastor Williams that she was entering this marriage as an independent woman making her own choice, not as someone being transferred from one man's care to another's. The symbolism was perfect for a wedding that had originated from two people choosing each other despite every conventional expectation. As she walked toward me, our eyes met and held, and I felt something I'd never experienced during any of the wedding planning with Madison. Complete peace, total certainty, absolute joy at the thought of spending the rest of my life with the person approaching me. When Sophie reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to Lucy and turned to face me with a smile that made my heart skip. Pastor Williams began the ceremony with words he'd crafted specifically for our unique situation. We gathered today to witness something extraordinary. Not just the marriage of Jake and Sophie, but the triumph of authentic love over convenient arrangement, the genuine partnership over social expectation, of courage over safety. He paused and looked out at the assembled guests, all of whom were hanging on every word. This morning, Jake and Sophie each faced a choice. They could have responded to betrayal with bitterness, to disappointment with despair, to unexpected freedom with fear. Instead, they chose to see opportunity where others might see disaster, to find love where others might find only loss. The ceremony continued with vows that we'd written together that afternoon, words that reflected both the unusual circumstances that had brought us to this moment and the genuine commitment we were making for the future. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly into Sophie's eyes and said the words I'd been thinking about all day. Sophie, this morning I thought I was going to marry someone who saw me as an accessory to her life. Instead, I get to marry someone who sees me as a partner in building something together. You've shown me what it feels like to be truly known and appreciated, and I promise to spend the rest of our marriage making sure you feel the same way. Sophie's vows were equally personal and heartfelt. Jake, I've loved you since the first conversation we had when you asked me about my family and my dreams and actually listened to my answers. You've shown me what it looks like when someone values my thoughts and opinions. I promise to spend our marriage being the partner you deserve, not just the one you settled for. When Pastor Williams asked for the rings, Tom stepped forward, with a grin that suggested he was enjoying his starring role in what was quickly becoming legendary family history. The ring exchange felt both symbolic and deeply practical, a physical representation of the commitment we were making and a tangible reminder of the choice we'd made to build something together, by the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride. The kiss that followed was nothing like the ceremonial peck that typically ends wedding ceremonies. It was the kiss of two people who'd finally found each other after months of looking in the wrong places. The kiss of a couple who knew they'd just committed to the adventure of a lifetime. The applause from the guests was thunderous, but it was a different quality of celebration than typical wedding applause. This was the sound of people who'd witnessed something genuinely moving, a real-time love story that had unfolded in front of their eyes. As Sophie and I walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I could see the amazement and delight on the faces of our guests. These weren't people politely celebrating a social obligation. These were friends and family members who understood that they'd just witnessed something special, a couple who'd chosen each other against all odds and conventional wisdom. The receiving line that followed was unlike any wedding reception interaction I'd ever experienced. Instead of the typical, polite congratulations and small talk, guests were genuinely excited to share their thoughts about what they'd just witnessed. Jake, I have to tell you, said my college friend Mike, I never thought you and Madison were right for each other, but I never imagined anything like this would happen. Sophie is perfect for you." Similar sentiments were echoed by guest after guest. People who'd known me for years were commenting on how much happier I looked, how much more natural this relationship seemed, how obvious it was that Sophie and I belonged together. The reception that followed maintained the same energy of celebration and amazement. The dinner that had been planned for Jake and Madison's wedding became a celebration of Jake and Sophie's marriage. And somehow, the food tasted better, the music sounded more joyful, and the dancing felt more spontaneous than any wedding reception I'd ever attended. During our first dance, Sophie and I were alone on the dance floor for the first few minutes, and she looked up at me with an expression of pure contentment. "How do you feel about being married to me?" she asked. Like I just woke up from a dream I didn't know I was having. I replied, "How do you feel about being married to someone who proposed to you the same morning his fiancée eloped with his best man?" Sophie laughed, and the sound was everything I'd been missing without realizing it. Like I've been waiting my whole life for you to figure out we belong together. As other couples joined us on the dance floor, I caught sight of Danny Rodriguez, capturing every moment, documenting what was already becoming the most talked about wedding in Millbrook Valley history. But more importantly, he was preserving the beginning of a marriage that felt more genuine and promising than anything I'd dared to hope for when I woke up that morning. The evening was perfect in ways that no amount of planning could have achieved. Because it was real, unscripted, and born from genuine emotion rather than social expectation, everything felt authentic and meaningful as the reception continued. Into the evening, I realized that Madison and Ryan had unknowingly given me the greatest gift of my life. Their betrayal had freed me to marry the woman I should have chosen from the beginning. And their selfishness had created the circumstances for a love story that was already being called the most romantic wedding anyone had ever attended. But the evening was about to become even more memorable, because at exactly 9 o'clock, just as Sophie and I were cutting the wedding cake, 2 unexpected guests arrived at Riverside Gardens Estate. Madison and Ryan had returned from Vegas, and they were about to discover exactly how thoroughly their plan had backfired. The black BMW pulled into the parking lot at Riverside Gardens Estate, just as Sophie and I finished cutting our wedding cake. Through the reception hall windows, I could see 2 figures getting out of the car, and my heart rate immediately accelerated as I recognized Madison's distinctive silhouette and Ryan's confident stride. They'd obviously expected to return to an empty venue, maybe to collect forgotten items or to face minimal consequences for their morning escape. Instead, they were walking into a fully active wedding reception, celebrating the marriage of the 2 people they'd betrayed. Sophie noticed them first, her hand tightening on my arm as she spotted the approaching figures through the French doors that opened onto the garden terrace. "Jake," she said quietly, "we have company." The reception was in full swing, with guests dancing and celebrating around us, completely unaware that the drama of the day was about to reach its climax. Danny Rodriguez was still photographing the festivities, capturing candid moments of joy. That would serve as perfect contrast to whatever was about to unfold. Madison and Ryan entered through the main reception hall doors, and the effect on the room was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, dancing couples paused in place, and everyone turned to stare at the 2 people who'd created this entire situation. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Madison looked exactly like someone who'd spent the day traveling and getting married in Vegas. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and she was wearing a simple white sundress that looked hastily chosen. But more than her appearance, it was her expression that told the whole story. She was staring at Sophie and me with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that looked suspiciously like panic. Ryan appeared equally stunned, but his reaction was different from Madison's. While she looked genuinely surprised by what she was seeing, he looked angry, as if our wedding was somehow a personal insult to him. Pastor Williams, who was still at the venue enjoying the reception, stepped forward to break the uncomfortable silence. "Madison, Ryan, what an unexpected surprise. Jake and Sophie just got married. Perhaps you'd like to offer your congratulations to the happy couple." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Madison struggling to process what was happening. She'd clearly expected to return to find me devastated and humiliated, probably hiding at home while everyone gossiped about how my fiancé had abandoned me on our wedding day. Instead, she was looking at a room full of people celebrating my marriage to her former maid of honor. "This is impossible," Madison said finally, her voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You can't just marry someone else. We're supposed to get married today." Sophie stepped slightly forward, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent room. "Madison, you left Jake a note this morning saying you were eloping with Ryan. That tends to cancel wedding plans. But I didn't mean for him to marry you," Madison said, and the selfishness of the statement was so obvious that several guests audibly gasped. Ryan finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive confidence he'd always used when he felt threatened. "This is ridiculous, Jake. You're obviously just trying to get back at us. This isn't a real marriage." That comment proved to be a mistake, because it prompted my brother Tom to step forward from the crowd of guests. "Actually, Ryan, it's completely real. I was the best man. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and they have a marriage license from the courthouse. It's definitely more legitimate than whatever quickie Vegas ceremony you two went through." The mention of their Vegas wedding seemed to remind Madison and Ryan that they were also supposed to be celebrating their own marriage. But looking at them standing there in the reception hall, there was no indication they were particularly happy about their choice. Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching the confrontation with the sharp attention she brought to all social situations, chose that moment to approach Madison directly. "Madison Kelly, you treated my daughter's friend very poorly, and you treated Sophie very poorly too. You made them both help you plan a wedding you knew you weren't going to have. It was dishonest and cruel." The public calling out for Mrs. Chen seemed to break something in Madison's composure. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Ryan and I just fell in love, and we couldn't help ourselves." "You could have been honest about it," I said, speaking directly to both of them for the first time since they'd arrived. "You could have told me weeks ago instead of letting me continue planning and paying for a wedding you knew wasn't going to happen. You could have saved everyone the drama and handled this like adults." Ryan's response revealed exactly why he'd never been as good a friend as I'd thought. "Come on, Jake. You have to admit this worked out better for everyone. You're obviously much happier with Sophie than you ever were with Madison." The comment was so tone-deaf and self-serving that even Madison looked embarrassed. He was essentially asking me to thank him for betraying me because the consequences had accidentally worked out in my favor. "Ryan," I said, "you're right. I'm happier with Sophie than I ever was with Madison. But that doesn't excuse what you did, and it doesn't make us friends." Sophie squeezed my hand and looked directly at Madison. "Madison, I hope you and Ryan are very happy together. But Jake and I are going to continue celebrating our wedding now, and I think it would be best if you both left." The dismissal was polite but firm, and it was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear Sophie wasn't asking for a debate. Madison looked around the room one more time, seeming to finally understand that no one was going to side with her, or treat her as a victim in this situation. She'd gambled that betraying Jake would leave her in a position of power, and instead, she'd found herself completely isolated. "Fine," she said, "but don't think this is over." Tom laughed out loud at that. "Madison, what exactly do you think is going to happen?" "Jake is married to someone who actually loves him. All your mutual friends think you're terrible, and you're stuck with Ryan. It's definitely over." Madison and Ryan left without another word, walking out of the reception hall and back to their car while 120 wedding guests watched in complete silence. When the door closed behind them, the room erupted in conversation and laughter, as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for the confrontation to end. Danny Rodriguez captured the moment perfectly, photographing our guests' relieved and delighted expressions as they realized the drama was finally over and they could return to celebrating. Sophie and I spent the rest of our wedding reception receiving congratulations from guests who were amazed by how well we'd handled the confrontation. Instead of letting Madison and Ryan ruin our evening, we'd demonstrated that their betrayal had actually freed us to find something better. 6 months later, Sophie and I learned that Madison and Ryan's Vegas marriage had lasted exactly 8 weeks. Apparently, people who are willing to betray their closest friends aren't particularly trustworthy partners for each other either. Sophie and I, on the other hand, are coming up on our first wedding anniversary, and we're planning to renew our vows at Riverside Gardens Estate. This time, we'll have a full year to plan the perfect celebration, and we won't have to worry about anyone eloping with the wedding party. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. Madison and Ryan thought they were destroying my life, but they actually saved me from making the biggest mistake I could have made. They freed me to marry my best friend, my perfect partner, and the love of my life. And every time someone asks us how we knew we were meant to be together, Sophie and I just smile and tell them that sometimes love finds you when you're planning to marry someone else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.